So what I'm going to talk about today is something very different, and it speaks to Leanne's point that she made first up, which was that effective governance is crucial to the solution. And it's not really a data paper, it's more of a riff of the concept paper that Terry talked about, coral reefs in the Anthropocene, and some of the work that both John and Terry have talked about, and it's about the paper. In this presentation, I want to sort of provide a blueprint for future governance in the centre. So we've established in recent works and research that's been undertaken in the centre and in the talks this morning that reefs have now entered the Anthropocene. They're continuing to reconfigure and decline. The return to past conditions is now seen as unattainable, and we're seeing new and unfamiliar coral reef ecosystems emerge. And this generates a governance challenge for Anthropocene reefs. So the debate in the public domain is whether we need completely new governance frameworks, radical changes to existing governance frameworks, or governance as usual. But before we can answer those questions, what we need to do as researchers, both natural and physical and interdisciplinary and social science researchers, is think about how we can understand governance in the Anthropocene. Because the Anthropocene doesn't just have natural and physical implications, it also has governance implications. And to do that, we need to get out of the comfort zone of reef science and management to date in thinking about governance. And it's not just about embracing the politics of governance, which is increasingly a hot and dirty game, but about embracing a redefinition of governance goals for how we approach management and governance in the Anthropocene. So increasingly I see scientists talking about moving from what I would call an approach which is about bounded restoration, so bounding a particular ecosystem and then seeking to restore it to either a historical or a current baseline based on current understandings of biodiversity, species and biomass, to an approach or a goal which is much more about targeted maintenance, so about targeted maintenance of changing ecological functions, changing processes and changing notions of ecosystem services. But let's just step back a bit first and think about how the Anthropocene has redefined governance goals. So this is a slide from some work I have in prep which looks at the changing nature of threats for the 27 coral reef World Heritage listed sites across the world. So you can see the GBR there, the orange circle of the coast of Australia. According to this work, this work looks at both World Heritage Committee and IUCN notions of threats to reef, and out of the 27 World Heritage listed coral reefs, they're, according to a combined assessment of both the IUCN and the WHC, about a third of those are either threatened or in danger, including the GBR. And the pressures in 2016 and 2017 on those reefs are increasingly diverse and multi-scale. So they are no longer just about the pressures of tourism and social change, of fishing and coastal agriculture, of invasive species and of pollution, but they're also of poor management and governance, mining, oil and gas development, war and illegal activities, urban and industrial development and the transport and energy infrastructure that goes with that, and increasingly climate change and natural disasters. So these are identified by the World Heritage Committee both through reporting up from the state parties, the governments in charge of those particular World Heritage listed coral reefs, as well as independent assessment from the scientific bodies advising the World Heritage Committee. And what we see is that the Anthropocene has not only redefined or highlighted the increasing diversity and global nature of these threats or drivers, if you want to call them, but they've also redefined the governance scale at which we need to be thinking about operating at. So no longer is reef governance just about local and regional governance, it's about multi-scale governance. from the local and regional to the transnational and the global. It's also then about redefining the governance stakeholders involved. So it's not just about thinking about the governance stakeholders in the immediate local regional bounds of a marine park, for instance, the fishers, the farmers and the local tourism operators. It's also about engaging with other governments, civil society, non-government organisations and non-profits, development organisations, businesses and industry, and at multiple scales, again, from the local to the global. And it's also about rethinking how we think about governance effectiveness. So it's no longer okay to just declare a marine park or to bring in a new piece of legislation. Governance stakeholders want to see the outputs of those interventions, the outcomes and the impacts, and there are increasingly sophisticated ways of understanding that from a governance perspective, to measuring the deliverables of a governance initiative, to measuring the behavioural change among participants targeted by that initiative, and then to looking at the actual physical impact on the ground or on the reef. And the Anthropocene is also redefining governance time. So, as I said, it's no longer acceptable to celebrate the snapshot success of the declaration of a marine park or the introduction of a new piece of legislation. Governance scientists are now looking at concepts like implementation lags, windows of opportunity, policy feedbacks and policy sequencing to understand how governance endures and maintains effectiveness over time. And ultimately what the Anthropocene has done is really redefine the very objects of governance. So the objects of governance in the past have been down in the bottom left-hand corner of this graph. The small group or individual fisher decisions, the tourism industry, local shipping or pollution incidents. But the objects are increasingly also including global markets, international conventions on global climate change or sea level rise, and so forth, industrial scale fishing. And what we're also seeing is an expanded range of governance options. And so here in this particular graph here, I want to highlight, although not endorse, the increasing number of papers published on geoengineering and coral reefs over the last decade or so. What I want to say here is that even though we might think in this room that this is madmen talking, there is increasing debate in the US, UK, Germany, Netherlands, Canada, Australia and the emerging economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa about the possibilities of geoengineering. But there's very little research that actually deals with it specifically. And this is an area that for natural and physical scientists and governance scientists or those working in the interdisciplinary edges of those fields, this is an area where there's a real research gap. Even the term geoengineering is essentially undefined and used very loosely. So it can range from the kind of coral propagation that John and Terry have mentioned earlier to really radical things like aerosol sprays and so forth. And so moving from one wildly expanded governance option to another, from geoengineering to social engineering, we're also seeing much more active talk about more active social intervention, about how to change norms through all sorts of different strategies, from the usual kinds of strategies that governments employ, like taxes, incentives and subsidies, or the education and communication strategies that NGOs and scientists might employ, to the much more radical strategies of lobbying, agenda setting and outright politicisation that social movements employ. And this particular move seems to engage very much with the idea that we as scientists have been unnecessarily distracted by insisting on evidence-based policy making, that policy making is inherently ideological and we need to engage with the ideology of policy making if we want to make a difference. Not to say that evidence-based policy making is not important, but it is also ideological and we can't not engage with that side of it. And this is an area which also is fast-moving and needs more research. So if coral coral reef science is moving in the direction of understanding coral reefs as changing through time, being subject to feedbacks, endogenous and exogenous forces, and needing to be adaptive to thinking about the nature of hierarchies and networks within those systems and of where the scale mismatches and institutional fit might be, then what does that mean for coral reef governance research? Well, it means that we need to be moving beyond. This is not to reject this, but to move beyond and add new dimensions to this current focus or the past focus on local proximal management and governance, focusing on fishing zones, local tourism taxes, invasive species control and project-based environmental assessment. And even beyond the Eleanor Ostrom-inspired work about multiscale institutional design, about local rules in use for local stakeholders, which can then be scaled up through networks of institutions and actors, to a much more complex environmental governance landscape, which involves strategic environmental planning, cumulative impact assessment, supply chain regulation, international agreements, a range of different instruments, including taxes, incentives, subsidies, education, communication, and overtly political strategies, and how they all mix together and then sequence over time. And many of these last instruments and governance tools are still very much in the literature as pipe dreams rather than realities, and there's a lot of research required in order to make, for instance, tools like cumulative impact assessment real on the ground. So coming back to my final question, how do we understand reef governance in the Anthropocene? We understand it through explicitly recognising that reefs are changing through time, and so are the human societies that depend on them, that the drivers are now multiscale and global and they have cumulative effects, that there is an increasingly urgent need for effectiveness, and to address that we need to acknowledge the multiscale social and political complexity of reefs and the wildly expanding set of governance options, and do all of that as researchers and scientists with an eye to providing future practical recommendations and guidance. And this is an area in which there is wide scope for the Centre to expand its research. Thank you.